Good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for finding time to be with me this afternoon. The show is Diaspora Dispatches. My name is Miriam Ogutu, and as usual, it is nice to have you on board. And this afternoon, we will have a topical discussion. I know I brought you the news, what is happening on the continent earlier on, and I think the rest we shall catch you up tomorrow, God willing. But for us this afternoon, I'd like for us to continue with what we have been looking at several times on our subsequent shows, and that is what has been happening in Ethiopia. We know last week there were some breakthrough as far as mediation process is concerned, and even as we're speaking right now, there is some continuation of the same process here in Nairobi by President Uhuru Kenyatta and former President of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, and the other part of the mediators who were conducting this process in South Africa last week. I think they are here in Nairobi, and as we speak, that mediation process is continuing. I think right now they are talking about disarmament between the government forces and the TPLF and other stakeholders. So I shall be bringing you up to date. I don't know if you'll be able to get the details of that meeting, but it is continuing right now. But for us, before we even go further into the conversation, I think it will be appropriate for us to understand the background of this conflict that has now claimed so many lives, that has caused devastating amount of human rights abuses, and has made so many people leave their homes. And from the reports that we've been receiving, there has been a lot of suffering, and so much of these abuses that even meet the threshold of what some might consider warranted even to be taken to this international criminal court that we have, even in the ICC and other places. But I will digress. That is not the path I'd like for us to take this afternoon. And so progress is being made, and I will continue to highlight some of that. But before then, I'd like for us to just have a very quick background information on this conflict. The Tigray War, as it has become to be known, is an armed conflict that began on the 3rd of November 2020. So the 3rd of November this year marked exactly 2 years since the start of this war in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. The war is primarily being fought by the Ethiopian federal government forces and the Eritrea on one side, and the Tigray People Liberation Front, TPLF, on the other side, after years of increased tensions and hostility. So this was a culmination of certain factors, and I think there are some political and other factors that also acted to fuel this war. But maybe a historical and political background has to do so much with what is happening today in Ethiopia. But I think it is so wide, so I'll not get into the details right now. I think it deserves a show by itself, so I will just restrict myself to just the recent, background of what really led to this war now that started on the 3rd of November 2020. But soon I'll bring us the historical and political context that we're able to fully understand even how TPLF was formed and what necessitated it in the 1970s, and how they were in power in Ethiopia for 27 years, and then what happened when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, but that is a conversation for another time. So anyway, after years of increased tensions and hostilities between the TPLF and the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea, fighting began with the Tigrayan security forces attacked ENDF Northern Command bases and headquarters in the Tigray region. The ENDF counterattacked in Tigray from the south, where Eritrean forces began launching attacks from the north. So it has been a concerted effort between the Ethiopian government and Eritrean forces, coming in on Tigray and forces and the Tigrayan region, and the Tigrayan TPLF trying to fight both from their in between. So anyway, the ENDF counterattacked in Tigray from the south, as I have explained, while the forces began launching attacks from the north. The Eritrean forces, which Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed described as law enforcement operations. So this is what the government of Ethiopia has been calling this war that has been ongoing there. The Federal Allied Forces captured Mekelle, the capital of Tigray region, on 28th November last year, after which Abiy declared the operation over. However, the Tigray government started soon afterwards, and it will continue fighting until the invaders, that is the federal government and the federal forces, now the Tigray forces were terming them as invaders. And it's important. Let me just put a pin there. It is important to understand that when you look at this conflict, and if you've been watching us, I'm sure you will agree with what we've been saying here. The conflict in Ethiopia, say with the ongoing conflict in say Somalia, or the ongoing conflict between the Anglophones and the Cameroonian government, or the indigenous people of Biafra and the Nigerian government, they have a different connotation. The TPLF do not want to leave Ethiopia. That is not the motivating factor. These are people who were in power for 27 years, so they feel very part and parcel of this country. So there's no question of they want to have their own country. They want to create their own place. They want to have their own autonomy. That's not it. But as we know, Ethiopia is a federal government made of several states, and it appears each state, as much as they do have certain rights, but to some extent, but they still are under the federal government of Ethiopia that is led by Abiy Ahmed. So perhaps that is maybe where the lines are not very clear. To what extent does the power of a state end, and to where does the power of the national government, of the federal government, start? So I don't know if that is not very clear for them. Otherwise, I don't know why would TPLF feel as though the government, the federal government, was outstepping outside of its mandate. Okay, so we will continue. And so when the federal government of Ethiopia captured Tigray's capital, that is Mekelle, and the TPLF said, we have to fight the enemy and the invaders until they leave. Remember, this is the federal government of Ethiopia, so there's no way they can be termed as invaders in its own place within the country. I don't think if soldiers, maybe a barracks from Nairobi, went to one in Mombasa, the coastal town of Kenya, and then the people in Mombasa there will feel as if these are invaders. No, this is one country. But as I said there, the federal system in Ethiopia works a bit different. And I think maybe one time we'll dedicate a show to look at these countries that has federal systems in the continent and how that is working for us, and is it a type of governance that fully appreciates Africa in its context, that fully is able to address the political, the cultural and other needs that forms, these different backgrounds as far as Africa governance is concerned, with examples like now Ethiopia, Nigeria, Somalia, and do we have another federal government in the continent? I'll check it up. But anyway, and so they termed the Ethiopian government forces as invaders, and they swore that they have to continue fighting until they remove these invaders. And on 28th of June 2021, the Tigray Defense Forces retook Mekelle. By July the same year, remember this war started November 3rd, 2020, and so Tigray forces continue fighting. So on the 28th of June 2021, they took over back their capital, Mekelle. By July the same year, they had also advanced into the Amhara and Afar regions. In early November 2021, almost a year ago, the TDF, together with the Oromo Liberation Army, OLA, took control of several towns on the highway south from Tigray region towards Addis Ababa, and the TPLF stated that it was considering marching on to Addis Ababa. So that was a threat within itself towards the federal government of Ethiopia, and together with 7 smaller rebel groups, the TPLF OLA declared a coalition aiming to dismantle Abiy's government by force or by negotiations, and then form a transitional government. Now, I'm trying not to get so much into what led to it's a whole background, and because of the interest of time, I'm trying to just pick and choose some information that will get us to exactly what I want us to talk about, and that is the mediation process. And yes, so I think I'll just leave that there. I'll just leave that there. I'll not go into the elections that made the TPLF went ahead with the elections that were cancelled anyway against the federal government's wishes and all that, because these are things we talk about here every day. So I'll just leave that for now. So I'd like for us to now get into the topic of what we are talking about this afternoon. Like I said, there were progress that were made last week as far as mediation process is concerned. So I'll just fast forward. Now, there were some ceasefire that was reached in March this year, and then after 5 months that appeared to be quiet and the gun seems to be a bit silent, on 24th of August, fighting resumed between the federal government of Ethiopia and the Tigrayan forces, ending the 5-month-long humanitarian truce, which had been agreed upon on the 24th of March this year. The Ethiopian government declared an indefinite humanitarian truce during that time in March to improve the dire humanitarian situation in the northern part of the country and to give peace a chance. The Tigray People's Liberation Front TPLF reciprocated by expressing willingness to respect the truce and cessation of hostilities on condition of an adequate and timely humanitarian assistance. The truce largely held for 5 months, like I said, from March to August this year, and for paving the way for some positive measures towards ending the conflict that first broke out, like I said, in November 2020. Now, on June this year, 27th precisely, the Ethiopian government announced the names of 7-member negotiating team led by Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister Demeke Mekonnen in a bid to find a resolution to the conflict. And on the 28th July of this year, Redwan Hussein, a member of the negotiating team and National Security Advisor to the Ethiopian Prime Minister, tweeted that his government's readiness for peace talks anytime, anywhere, and without preconditions. So at this point, the TPLF was saying, we are ready for a truce, we are ready to engage, we want to sit on the negotiating table, we are ready to iron out these issues that brought us to where we are today. And at that point also, the Ethiopian government, through its spokespersons, through the ministry, through the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Ministry, came out and said the Ethiopian government is also ready for these talks anytime, anywhere, and without preconditions. Now that sounded good, right? Okay. Now, earlier in June, the leadership of Tigray also issued a statement expressing willingness to participate. So there was a willingness from both parties, all right? And they said as long as this participation or these talks or this mediation process is held in a manner that is credible, impartial, and principled, that is the only way they will come and sit on the table and be part of this process. Meanwhile, the African Union, AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa, former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, as well as the US, European Union, and the United Nations envoys to the region, engaged in shuttle diplomacy, trying to bring parties to the negotiating table. However, such efforts did not register a major results. So remember, before President Uhuru Kenyatta was roped in earlier last month, which he was not quite available for because he had other engagements. The first talks that were supposed to be happening in South Africa. And then later in October, he joined the mediation team, and we saw that bear some fruits. So in the meantime, Olusegun Obasanjo had been trying to mediate through and has been engaging in shuttle diplomacy, but that did not register any major results so far. So there are three sticking points, and perhaps even as they continue with the talks here in Nairobi, those are the things they're ironing out from the observations that we've been making. And these were key things that were preventing the peace process from making any headways at that time. The first is diverging positions of who was to lead the peace process. Tigray Regional Government, in its 13th June open letter, flagged up its concern over the proximity of Obasanjo, the former president of the federal government of Nigeria. They're saying he is too cozy with Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and because of that, they did not feel as if he was the best person to lead this mediation, so that they made them not to really want to participate in this mediation process fully because of the proximity of Obasanjo to Abiy Ahmed. And the regional government, that is the TPLF, also sought to have the peace talks facilitated by Kenyan President, then, now former President Uhuru Kenyatta, with the support of international partners including US, EU, United Arab Emirates, UN, and African Union, and relegating the AU to a supportive role. So they did not, in short, they did not have confidence in an AU-led mediation. They're saying the AU, needless to say, whose headquarters are in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The TPLF was saying the AU should be given a supportive role. They should not be the convener of this mediation process. They should not be the spearheaders of this mediation process. And that is because they did not have the confidence in AU, one, because of the person they had chosen in the name of a former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, to lead the process, and also in the manner in which they had accused AU of handling this process so far, and this issue and this conflict in Ethiopia. And so the federal government, on the other hand, that is the Ethiopian government, stood by its position that the AU should be responsible for the mediation. So that was already a deadlock from the get-go. And apart from just saying the AU should lead the mediation, the federal government under Abiy Ahmed also said Obasanjo will be the person to continue with the mediation, whether the TPLF likes it or not. So that was the first sticking issue that really made this process not make any headways from the beginning. So the federal government, as I said, and so Obasanjo was appointed by the chairperson of African Union Commission as the High Representative of the Horn of Africa on the 26th August 2021 for a period of 1 year that was renewable. So on August this year again, his contract was renewed for him to continue. Never mind that he had not achieved anything in that 1 year he had been working since last year when he was appointed to this in August. He had not even delivered any major progress so far, but I think his contract was renewed for whatever reason, but maybe it was for good reasons. And okay, so it was renewed this year. So anyway, so that is one of the key sticking points, the disagreement or the diverging positions on who should lead the mediation process. So the second sticking point and why this mediation process took as long as it did was the lifting of the blockade and restoration of basic services to the Tigray region, which led to a cut-off of electricity, telecommunication services, banking, and other basic utilities since the withdrawal of the federal troops from the region in June 2021. And the regional government, that is the TPLF, demanded restoration of basic services before talks begin, what the federal government wanted to see, an enabling environment upon the conclusion of a ceasefire agreement for basic services to resume. So the TPLF was saying, can you make sure basic services in our region are up and running before we come to the table? And the federal government was saying, no, I'd like for us to agree on a ceasefire. I'd like for us to sit down and have a talk so that we have an enabling environment, and so the federal government can come back and restore those services that you badly need in that region. So that was also a sticking point. I don't know if that has been solved, but from reports that we're receiving from that region, a lot of these services are still not fully present in the Tigray region. And the third sticking points, as I started by saying, there were three key sticking points that had made these mediation process not to be as successful since Obasanjo had been appointed to this position in August 2021. And the first one was they were not they were not agreeing on who should lead the mediation process. The second was the conditions that the TPLF had put for some of the basic services that were withdrawn from the region and that were affected in the region to be returned, like banking, like electricity, like telecom, I guess water, and things like that, for there to be a ceasefire. And the government of the federal government of Ethiopia insisted, no, there has to be some ceasefire agreement first before we can agree to resume these services. So that was also a sticking point, and also just to allow for humanitarian aid to get to the Tigray region, because that also has been a huge challenge as far as that is concerned. And the third and perhaps the most challenging hurdle remained the status of the contested areas of the so-called Western Tigray, that is the Welkite, Tegere, Telimt, and Humera, a strategic hotspot bordering Sudan and Eritrea. Both Tigray and Amhara regions have historic claim over these areas that were under the administration of Tigray. And until the Amhara took over control of the areas following the federal forces' advances in the Tigray region in November 2020. Now, the TPLF wants a return to the pre-war status, but withdrawal from the contested area seems to be a deal breaker for the federal government, as that will mean opening up a weapon supply line for Tigray forces and putting Abiy's government on a coalition course with the Amhara and Eritrean forces. A very slippery slope there for the Ethiopian government. So on September 7th, the president of the Tigray regional state, Debretsion Gabriel-Michael, wrote an open letter to the United Nations Security Council proposing a cessation of hostilities with 4 conditions: lifting of the blockade on essential services, unfettered humanitarian access, withdrawal of Eritrean forces under international monitoring, and a return to pre-war borders of Tigray. These states or these regions in Ethiopia, and how that governance structure is structured there, how the governance is structured there, they do enjoy certain rights and privileges as regions within Ethiopia. And so by the government of Ethiopia, the federal government of Ethiopia, taking over some of these key towns within Tigray, that meant that part of the pre-war borders was violated. And so the Tigrayans are saying, can we go back? Can we return to the pre-war agreements that allowed us some level of power and control on certain regions that now Ethiopian government have invaded, as the Tigrayans, the TPLF was saying, and have occupied. So can we be allowed, can we go back to that agreement so we can be allowed to get a hold of these regions that have been under our control? And in addition, it proposed the appointment of a credible panel of high-level international mediators, further highlighting the reservation over the AU High Representative. So they did not have any kind of faith on the mediation that was being led by former president of the federal government of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo. And as fighting escalated, diplomatic engagement also intensified with the return of the US and AU special envoys back to Addis Ababa in a bid to silence the guns. The engagement reportedly succeeded in bringing federal government and TPLF together for a direct talk in Djibouti at one time, but neither side confirmed this meeting. On the Ethiopian New Year, which falls on September 11th, the regional government of the Tigray issued a statement during this New Year, offering an immediate and mutually agreed cessation of hostilities in a clear departure from its 7th September letter. That letter it had written on the 7th to the United Nations, and now on 11th it issued. Remember the letter that I just read you up there with the 4 conditions? So on 11th, the statement that it issued was a clear departure from the statement it had issued on the 7th and the letter to the United Nations. So it was a clear departure, and the Tigray regional state agreed to a credible AU-led peace process. So as much as they had a problem with the AU representative Olusegun Obasanjo, as much as they had a problem with other things, they felt they needed the Ethiopian government to honor, but they said this time, I think all we want is a credible AU-led peace process. And initially they wanted AU to just play a second fiddle in this mediation process. They did not want AU to spearhead this process, but 11th of September, they changed tunes. So I guess they realized Abiy wasn't giving, so they had to somehow meet in the middle. Okay, you can't fight a national government sometimes. I think they realized, so they had to cede grounds a little bit, and I think that is a spirit of mediation. For any mediation to be successful, there has to be some level of compromise. You can't get everything you want, and I think they realized that. So I don't know if Abiy Ahmed realized anything yet, but anyway, so they said as long as this process that is being led by AU is credible, we have no problem. And we are mutually accepted mediators, international observers, and international experts. As long as it meets this threshold, we have no problem. The federal government did not respond to that offer, and fighting continued on multiple fronts. That is, even after the September 11th, letter. And of course, while the fighting was ongoing, that delayed the process, and eventually the conflict, that would have been settled through negotiation, just continued to escalate. And key actors such as the US and the EU that have significant leverage on both parties, seemed to be backing the peace process under the AU's auspice. So they were not interested to bring in the United Nations. They were not interested to bring in European Union. They said, this is an African problem. Can you try to find an African solution for it? And I think, for my own personal opinion over this conflict, what I've been saying is, this is a political problem. So a military solution, there's no way that would have been the answer to this conflict in Ethiopia. A political problem, you find a political solution. A military problem like that in Somalia, where you have to fight extremisms and militants, that's when you implore a military solution. But a political problem to a people who still feel they're part of that country and they're not fighting to leave, but maybe the way they were engaging the federal government was a bit aggressive, and maybe the federal government thought it needed to make some statement like, hey, we're still the federal government, so make no mistake. But still, I've always felt this is a political problem. Get a political solution. Like the way now they're talking and mediating and ironing out these issues. That's how you find a solution. You don't approach a political problem with a military solution. It never works. I'm not even a security expert, but I know that does not mix very well. You're only escalating things, as we have been seeing this situation in Ethiopia. So the AU's Peace and Security Council, which is a 15-member standing decision-making organ of the organization, with the primary responsibility for promoting and maintaining peace, security, and stability in the continent, met 3 times during this conflict, only 3 times. On the 8th of November 2021, when this conflict erupted, the conflict erupted on the 3rd of November 2020. So they met a year later. And then on the 10th February 2022 and on the 4th August 2022. That is the AU's Peace and Security Council, an organ within the African Union that is mandated to promoting and maintaining peace, security, and stability in the continent. So this conflict of Ethiopia, or inside Ethiopia, that has been escalating, apparently was not of any urgency as far as the African Union is concerned, as far as the Peace and Security Council is concerned, and that is its prime mandate. It only met 3 times, and the first time it met, it was a year after this conflict broke. You think about that. And Obasanjo has briefed the PSC 3 times so far, but none of the briefings except the last one in August. That is before they started in this other process, extended to interactive engagements with PSC. So within the year that Obasanjo was appointed to be the lead mediator, he had only met the PSC, that is the Peace and Security Council, only 3 times. Only 3 times to update them. And even with that, there's no progress that was being recorded. Look at that. So anyway, that brings us to the 2nd of November, where the Ethiopian government and the rival Tigray People Liberation Front, TPLF forces, had an agreement on the 2nd of November and signed a permanent cessation of hostilities. And I think I do have that release by African Union, so I think I'm just going to read it because it's not very long. I'm just going to read it from their website. Allow me to do that. I'll just keep the first few lines, appreciating the people who participated in that peace process. And let me see where I can start from. Now, the member of the African Union Panel of the Wise are pleased to announce that the successful conclusion of the Ethiopian peace talks in Pretoria, South Africa. The talks between the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which was launched on the 25th of October 2022, sought to secure a cessation of hostilities agreement between the parties, paving the way for the restoration of peace, security and stability in the Tigrayan region. The agreement marks an important step in efforts to silence the guns and provides a solid foundation for the preservation of Ethiopia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The immediate cessation of hostilities, the resumption of unhindered humanitarian access, the restoration of services, as well as healing and reconciliation. The panel congratulates and commends the parties for their commitment, diligence, and stellar leadership throughout the process, and for prioritizing the Ethiopian people and the supreme interest of the Ethiopian nation. As the country embarks on this next chapter in its great history, the panel affirms its commitment and readiness to continue accompanying the process towards a more democratic, just, and inclusive Ethiopia in which youth, women, and men participate fully in peace. The high-level panel expresses its gratitude to the chairperson of the African Union, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, for entrusting them with this historic task. Anyway, and it continues, but I think it captured what was really agreed, and that is the cessation of hostilities agreement between the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Okay, so that is what happened last week, and as I was saying, today, as we speak, talks resumes today in Nairobi, the mediation process between the conflicting parties in the Tigray after the cessation agreement signed in Pretoria on Wednesday 2nd. at the center of the meetings hosted by Kenya, and which will continue under the mediation of the African Union, will be disarmament and humanitarian access to the Tigray region. The arrival of the participant was confirmed this morning on Twitter by former Kenyan president and facilitator of the talks, President Uhuru Kenyatta, specifying that after Nairobi, the dialogue foresees stops in the Tigray capital Mekelle in Addis Ababa, in the hope of finalizing the agreement in the capital. We are now in Nairobi, that is what the federal government tweeted, then Mekelle in Tigray, and we hope to finalize in Addis Ababa. So the agreement, as I said, was announced last week. So they're meeting. Let me not get into the details there. I'll be repeating myself. So as you speak right now, the mediation process are continuing now in Nairobi. Remember, the agreement that was signed last week on the 2nd of November was for the cessation of hostilities. Okay? Was the cessation of hostilities, and I think that was the very first and very important steps. So I've not heard any more fighting ongoing. I don't know if there has been allowed access to that region, but I know the agreement was on cessation of hostilities agreement between the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. So it was between these two parties, and there are some people who were left out of this agreement, like the Oromo Liberation Movement, who felt they had been shortchanged. Remember, at some point they were fighting in support of the TPLF, and now I guess from a conversation we were having here last week, they were reported to have have been fighting with some federal forces in some region, and I think they were expressing their disapproval of that agreement that was signed in South Africa, majorly because they felt they were also important stakeholders in this process, but they were not invited to the table and they were not involved. And so perhaps they just wanted to be heard. So hopefully the federal government of Ethiopia will reach out, and this mediation team will reach out to the rest of everybody else that is involved in this, and just see if they can achieve a wholesome peace talks and agreement between every faction in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, because I think it's very important so that these matters can be ironed out as quickly as possible. So we were just looking at the process. And of course, according to AU, the two sides agreed to a disarmament plan, as well as an unhindered access to humanitarian supplies, as I have said there, and the resumption of halted basic services to Tigray. And I think I've talked about that. Now, even as they look at the internal issues and the internal dynamics inside of Ethiopia that have been a catalyst and that have been fueling this war, there are other factors that we cannot afford to assume, or we cannot afford not to concern ourselves with as far as this conflict is concerned. And specifically, the African Union should pay attention to the regional dynamics that are adding up an additional layer to this very already complex internal armed conflict in Ethiopia. And that is the issue of Eritrea. That is something that we cannot wish away. And Eritrea should not be allowed to get away with the part that it played towards what has been happening in Ethiopia. So Eritrea's reported involvement, because there have been several reports that actually have placed Eritrea at the scene of crime. The Eritrean forces have been there. Matter of fact, just a few weeks ago, the Eritrean government was mobilizing its young people to join the army to go and fight the Tigrayan forces. So the issue of Eritrea must be addressed. The African Union must take up the issue of Eritrea and its involvement in Ethiopia's internal matter. I know perhaps they came in under the invitation of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. I don't know if there are credible reports to support that, But I don't see how Eritrean forces will come start fighting TPLF forces if the government of Ethiopia did not give it a nod. So we need to interrogate this matter further. And of course, there's been some border tension between Ethiopia and Sudan. And we cannot forget the controversy between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt over the Grand Renaissance Dam that Ethiopia built. And Sudan did not have a problem with that dam until I think Egypt spoke so much on its ear, and all of a sudden Sudan had a problem with this dam, that the hydroelectric dam that Ethiopia was building for the last 10 years. So now all of a sudden Sudan has a problem, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So we have to see how these matters really interlink each other, that are further compounding and fueling this situation. So the AU should perhaps look at how it can contextualize how it's going to go further with its intervention over this conflict, because just having talks between Ethiopia's government and the TPLF is not enough. We must look at these regional issues that also could be playing a bigger part in fueling this conflict is concerned. Otherwise, all these efforts might count to naught. So we need to go further with our intervention. AU, you need to go further and go to Eritrea and have a talk with Isaias Afwerki, the president of Eritrea, and then look at what could be the link of in the Grand Renaissance Dam that Ethiopia has been building, is now I think over 85% done, and how that could be having an interlink with these countries that we know have not been supportive of it. Sudan being one of them, and of course Egypt being the country that feels it's most aggrieved. And I think soon I'll bring you, we shall look at the Nile waters politics and how those some of those agreements that were signed, giving which countries what rights as far as the Nile River is concerned, and if at all that is stands ground in the 21st century. We will look at that some other time. But I think for me, there's other things that the African Union needs to go further as far as its interventions is concerned. So the meeting in Nairobi, I'm told, will continue for the rest of this week. So we shall be bringing you up to date with the latest mediation efforts over the Ethiopian conflict. But I think so far, I just wanted for us to have an understanding of what is happening there in Ethiopia. So I want to thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and I will see you again tomorrow with more of these discussions from across the continent of Africa. My name is Miriam Ogutu. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye for now.